Thank you so much, Sam. So Sam Rumschlag is going to walk us through partially like the arc of his professional life so that we can understand and process with him the ways that cultural heritage management, cultural resource management, museum work has been part of his path. That's going to give us insights.
Yeah, so I am also located right now in south central Wisconsin on land that is also like historically home to the Hochunk people. And there are 11 federally recognized tribes in the state of Wisconsin, and the Potawatomi a little further east, the Chippewa up north, but I operate primarily on land that's historically Hochunk. To take you a little bit through my past, just to begin at the very beginning. So I'm a U.S. Secretary of the Interior qualified archaeologist, and I'm an archaeologist recognized by the director of the Wisconsin Historical Society as qualified to work within human burial sites and to excavate human remains. At least in the state of Wisconsin, if you want to work on this topic specifically, there are a couple of qualifications you have to have over and above a university degree, and that Historical Society recognizance is one of them. Over the course of my career, as you mentioned, Dr. Young, I've worked for a variety of museums and public agencies, including the Department of Transportation, the Public Service Commission. And one of the primary things my career is focused on has been helping my employers comply with the variety of historic preservation, especially human burial protection statutes. Tonight, obviously, we're going to be focusing on the human remains side of things, as that's primarily the focus of NAGPRA. And while I don't work with NAGPRA directly, I do work directly with a suite of supporting laws and regulations at the state and federal level, um, which really I think are best described as helping us not repeat some of the bad things in history which have made NAGPRA necessary. Um, it definitely falls more on the ethics side of the equation.
Mhm.
As all of you know, that NAGPRA was originally created to take the first small steps in addressing the historical and ongoing injustices faced by many Native Americans regarding the treatment of their ancestors' remains and cultural heritage items. And NAGPRA was one of the first formal acknowledgments by the U.S. government that human remains, just of any and all ancestries, and I'll just quote a Senate report here from I think back in the 70s, recognizing that human remains must at all times be treated with dignity and respect. That's not something that's been done so well historically by government agencies. Um, but NAGPRA was a major first step in starting to correct some of those wrongs. Here in Wisconsin, we have our own set of burial laws that operate in support of that, and their focus is avoiding those wrongs to begin with rather than taking steps to address wrongs that have already been done. So like I said, it falls more on the ethics side of the equation. So while NAGPRA largely exists as, a small attempt to correct those past wrongs, I mostly focus on preventing wrongs in the present and in the future. Um, just going through some of my notes here. So I recognize that description is very high level and abstract. So if you'd like, I could just give you kind of a quick example of what that looks like on a day-to-day basis.
That'd be great.
Um, so to make it less abstract, I'd say let's just describe a hypothetical roadwork project. Say something fairly simple. Say we're converting a four-way stop to a roundabout, something that involves a fair amount of land disturbance. And so, like I said, we want to avoid disturbing human remains if at all possible, as required under Wisconsin Statute 15770. So we've set up a variety of processes to help us comply with that law and avoid those sorts of undesirable situations and to rectify them quickly if they should arise. So imagine we're converting this from just a simple four-way stop with all these conflict points to a roundabout with fewer conflict points. One of the first things that I would do in my role is I would receive a very, very basic mock-up project description, much like the illustration you're looking at on screen, showing what the intended project is, along with a legal description of the land where it's taking place. And the very first thing I would do is go do a database search of the Wisconsin Historic Preservation Database to see if there's anything previously known there. I mentioned that all human burial sites in Wisconsin are protected under Wisconsin Statute 15770. This database, the Wisconsin Historic Preservation Database, is the final say on whether a piece of land is legally considered to be a burial site under 15770. That's not to say that there can't be new discoveries made and additions, but on the front end, this is our first tool in our toolbox of determining whether there's a human burial site that we need to consider. I will add a caveat at this point that most human burial site locations are confidential and not disclosable to the public. So I'm going to have to limit my examples to examples that are disclosable, which is primarily just marked modern cemeteries with headstones. Um, but the process is the same, even though frequently we would be dealing with unmarked cemeteries, historic cemeteries, that sort of thing. So I will be using modern marked cemetery examples because I just can't disclose the location of unmarked burial sites. But the process is the same. So let's say, for example, that our hypothetical roadwork project is in St. Croix County in the town of Emerald. I would just fill out our little search window here, run a search, see what we come up with. So you can see here, there is one cemetery located at this hypothetical intersection we're working at, known as the Greenwood Cemetery, the Emerald Cemetery, located here in the southwest corner. As I said, often these are reported historic sites, often Native American sites. I can't disclose those locations, so we'll just work with this modern cemetery as an example. So we have a cemetery there. So what do we do now? The project can continue. I'll come to that in a moment. The project can continue, but there are a series of steps we have to take. Most of you are probably familiar with the concept of state historic preservation officers. That is an office authorized by the National Historic Preservation Act and present in every Wisconsin and every state historical society in the country in some form. And they are charged with regulating disturbance within human burial sites and helping public agencies like the Department of Transportation or any other agency really avoid that if it's possible. So the first thing we're going to do is reach out to our project team, our project engineer, and say, can you work on this without disturbing this burial site? In many cases, the answer is yes, and we'll just move one direction or the other so that we're no longer within the boundaries of that recorded burial site. Sometimes, due to a variety of factors, those options are limited. So that's when we start working with SHPO. There is a form that we would fill out for SHPO to review, just describing the nature of the project, the summary of the work within the burial boundary, and importantly, the cataloging status of that burial site. I'll take a quick moment to describe the difference between the cataloged and uncatalogued burial sites. Cataloged burial sites are burial sites where human remains are definitely present and they have been added to the state catalog of recorded burial sites, which essentially means that we have very precise, good information about the remains present. Think a modern cemetery with detailed land records, deeds, plot maps. We know exactly the situation regarding use of that plot of land for human remains. In those scenarios, SHPO office will work with the applicant, whether it's regardless of which agency or private company it is, to try to avoid disturbance if at all possible. And this is a very critical distinction between cataloged and uncatalogued burial sites. They can say no to work within cataloged human burial sites. If the work is going to cause undue disturbance to human remains, they can simply say, no, you're not doing that work. Oftentimes that isn't necessary though, because especially with modern burial sites, there's been a large safety buffer built in so that work can occur within the boundaries, within the legally recorded boundaries, without actually disturbing human remains, which is the main point of 15770. So the agency or the applicant and the SHPO's office would work together to figure out the situation to determine whether permission can be granted or whether there has to be a denial in this case. But what's more difficult, and what I usually end up working on, is proposed disturbances to uncatalogued human burial sites. And so these are the ones which, unfortunately, the records are much less concrete. I'll give you an example of what I frequently end up dealing with uncatalogued human burial sites. But these are situations where there is good reason to believe that the human remains are present, but we can't be certain exactly where they came from or how long they've been there, where they are. There's a lot of unknowns, essentially. And so legally, under 15770, SHPO cannot refuse to grant authorization to work within uncatalogued human burial sites, but they do have several tools within their toolbox that they can use to minimize the extent of disturbance and see that any inadvertent disturbance is quickly dealt with if it happens. This is usually what I end up dealing with in my job, because it is very rare. Like, I've only seen it a small handful of times in my career that anyone, whether it's a private company or a state agency, a government entity, will request to disturb a catalog site, because, again, the preference is so strong to avoid those. So this next section is really what I spend a lot of my day-to-day life doing. So as I said, the uncatalogued human burial sites, they are sites where we have good reason to believe that human remains are present, but there's not a lot of information beyond that. And those can take any and every form you can possibly imagine. Because a lot of development happened before the Wisconsin burial law passed, that only passed in 1985. So prior to that, at a state level, human burial sites were completely unprotected, legally speaking, in a practical sense.
Mhm.
Lots of people's houses, for example, are built on reported human burial sites. Lots of urban downtowns are built on reported human burial sites. Lots of roads are built through unreported human burial site or imprecisely recorded human burial sites. And that's really where things get complicated for me as an employee trying to help my employer minimize disturbance, but also progress with needed infrastructure projects. So let's take a look at what that looks like. One of the first things that we're going to do when dealing with an uncatalogued human burial site is go back and look at every piece of information we can possibly get our hands on regarding that burial site. And one of the best sources of those information comes from an individual named Charles E. Brown. He was an archaeology curator at the Wisconsin Historical Society in the early 20th century. And over the course of his decades-long career, he collected tens to possibly even hundreds of thousands of pieces of information on burial sites across the state of Wisconsin, which were subsequently, unfortunately, often destroyed, developed over, during that period between the early 20th century when he was collecting this information and 1985 when the Wisconsin burial law was passed and began being enforced. So I'm going to stop sharing here, and I've just prepared a verbal example that I'll read of what that often looks like. Just need a moment to switch windows.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up Brown. I've read hundreds of pages of typewriter and handwritten notes between Brown and colleagues around identifying these burials in order to protect and preserve them. And so seeing those correspondences through his leadership has been part of NAGPRA projects that I'm familiar with, because to your point, sometimes the only potential burial content is coming from very early documentation, right? That's not in a database at this point.
Yeah, exactly. And given the resources he was working with and the time that he was working, he did a really great job. But nearly 100 years later, sometimes, even though his information is the best that's available, it's still very difficult to get any level of certainty when you're working with it. And so there's an example of that I often give. Um, And while some of the information was highly specific and detailed, other information, especially that was coming to him from letters through collaborators and colleagues, was extremely vague and often not field verified, but it was used to build the modern database. So still it's recorded within there, and legally we have to go through the 15770 process when addressing it. So I have a representative example here, and I'll just read it out loud to you. This comes from a letter that was written to Brown in 1914 from an anonymous author, and the person wrote to Brown, and I'm going to quote: "When conducting excavations for his cellar in section 36 of the town of Emerald in St. Croix County, he encountered two skeletons and sundry grave goods," and it just kind of, trails off there, but that includes the part that I wanted to emphasize. So, from my perspective, trying to protect this burial site, which has been recorded based on this information, this is the information I have to work with. When somebody over 100 years ago was excavating for a cellar in section 36 of the town of Emerald in St. Croix County, he encountered human remains and grave goods. Now that's all I have to deal with. You can see how vague that information is.
Mhm.
So from a compliance perspective, I don't know exactly where in section 36 of the town of Emerald that person's house was that the cemetery was being excavated. And so I don't really have any information to work with besides that reported, you know, burial site was in section 36, which is, a square mile. That's 640 acres. From the perspective of an infrastructure project, that's huge. And usually what happens is that based on that information, the entirety of section 36 in the town of Emerald in St. Croix County would be flagged as a burial site and consequently accorded protections under the law. So anything happening within section 36 of the town of Emerald in St. Croix County is accorded, full protections under 15770, and we have to go through that prescribed process. So again, going back to our hypothetical roadwork project that we'll just pretend for this example is located in section 36 of the town of Emerald, we have a burial site that is an entire section, but the information supporting its existence is so vague that we can't just avoid the area. There are roads that go through section 36 and work needs to be done on them. So that at that point our focus shifts to precaution as our compliance. So in practice, the
Mhm.
first thing I would do is make additional effort to refine the location of that reported burial site based on the historical evidence. I would go through and look at all the other information I can get from that time period, look at the plat maps, the deed records, see if I can find out where that house being referred to was built. If that is possible, which often it isn't, but if it's possible, we can refine that location to one specific parcel of land in 1914 and say, okay, this is where the burial site was reported. We can go through a process with the Wisconsin Historical Society, fill out some paperwork, get them to adjust that mapping within the database, and now we know where those remains were originally encountered. We can protect that area, but the rest of section 36 is removed from the restrictions placed on it under 15770. But in
Mhm.
practice that rarely happens. So usually what happens is we're working within what is recorded as a burial site, but we know that it's one specific area that we need to look out for. And of course there's always inadvertent discoveries as well. But we know that the likelihood that the area where we're working is specifically what was being described at that time is not likely in the same place.
Mhm.
So, like I said, if we cannot refine the location of that burial site any further, which is what usually happens, we'll take additional compliance steps. So, that same form I showed you earlier, we'll fill that out, except we'll check uncatalogued burial site rather than uncatalogued. And as I said, SHPO cannot say no to a request to work within an uncatalogued burial site under the law. They can encourage other things to be done, but legally, if whoever's doing the work, whoever that is, whether it's a private company, a homeowner, because homeowners are subject to the burial protection site laws as well, a government agency, they have to grant permission if the person doing the work is insistent, but they can place legally binding restrictions on that work. And that's where we get into another compliance end of 15770, which focuses on respectful treatment and tribal consultation rather than getting us into a situation like the kinds of scenarios in the past where that today would require NAGPRA compliance. We don't want to do the sorts of things which made NAGPRA as a law necessary in the first place. We want remains to be treated respectfully and returned to their descendant communities from the start rather than end up in a collection somewhere where later NAGPRA compliance is needed to get them back to their back to their descendant communities and respectfully treated and reinterred. So just to kind of walk you through what that would look like. In the worst case scenario where human remains are encountered, there are strict legally binding protocols that must be followed. First, all work in the area of the site will stop. Work in that area has to stop completely, and people are redirected away from the area. In the event that human remains have been exposed, they are not to be left exposed to the elements. They're to be covered. They're to be treated respectfully. They are not to be touched, handled, or further disturbed in any fashion, and no photos are to be taken of them. That is all. That is all within the law. That is all legally binding. For violations of that, the Historical Society can and sometimes does issue consequences. The presence of the remains is not to be shared or discussed widely. It's not to be discussed with the media. It's not to be put on social media. Um, Curious onlookers are not to be given access to the site. Um, Privacy is paramount in the events of these situations. The supervising archaeologist will immediately, as soon as this happens, contact the local police or sheriff's office, who under 15770 are responsible for determining if the remains are associated with a criminal case. If Let me back up there. So yes, the sheriff's office or the police department first, who will determine if they're associated with a criminal case, and that's immediately followed by a call to the Wisconsin Historical Society to just inform them of the latest developments on the project, let them know that work has been stopped, and get them involved as necessary. They can begin contacting, tribal partners, etc., get that communication ball rolling. But as I said, the first step is for law enforcement to make a criminal case determination. Um, that's often pretty straightforward, not always. In many cases, the archaeologist will collaborate with law enforcement to make that final determination, even though the final call is, as I said, in the hands of law enforcement and the medical examiner. Um, but let's say hypothetically, it is determined that the encounter is determined to not be related to a criminal case. In that case, the supervising archaeologist, along with Whitrick and the Wisconsin Historical Society, will assume control of the situation. Most projects have unanticipated discovery plans in place for exactly this sort of occurrence. And in the event that determination is made that there's no criminal case and jurisdiction shifts to the Wisconsin Historical Society, the terms of those unanticipated discovery plans will be implemented. Usually, this involves professional excavation and temporary storage of the remains at a predetermined location. And then, if those are determined to be of Native American ancestry, they are surrendered as soon as possible to the Wisconsin Intertribal Repatriation Committee. Um, just to kind of give you a brief overview of what they do and who that committee is composed of. The Wisconsin Intertribal Repatriation Committee, also known as WITRIC for short, it is comprised primarily of representatives of Wisconsin tribal communities, including TIPOs, tribal elders, um, and so forth. And they have final authority over the repatriation and final reinterment or disposition of those remains.
And Sam, would you say that the entities that are all needing to have a role in the processing of the discovery of human remains, each entity wants to move along quickly with passing those remains to the appropriate next entity?
Yes, absolutely. The last thing,
Police and coroner want to quickly move it out of their
yes,
role responsibility to say historical society. So the historical society really wants to quickly move to Whitrick and consultation process, right? Like quickly.
yes. that's true across the board. Of course, you know, law enforcement wants to make that determination quickly. So if it is a criminal case, they can begin working on it immediately. And if it's not, that they can turn over jurisdiction to Wisconsin Historical Society. And it's the same situation with Wisconsin Historical Society. They can, and it's very situational. There are a lot of various contexts depending on ancestry and so forth. But in the event it's determined to be Native American, yes, they absolutely want to get Whitrick involved and the Whitrick process moving as quickly as they can, because the ultimate goal is reinterment, is repatriation and respectful reinterment. We don't want, I mean, we don't want this situation to arise at all to begin with, but if it does, we don't want anything languishing in bureaucratic
Right.
paperwork for a long time. We want to immediately get the descendant communities involved, let them consult among themselves, make the determination of um, the appropriate next steps, and that would be decided by Whitrick. Um, so rather than getting into a situation where the NAGPRA process would be required, we want to avoid those kinds of negative situations that gave rise to NAGPRA originally. So our first priority is doing everything possible to avoid disturbance, and in the event of unforeseen circumstances, that rapid repatriation to descendant communities is the next focus. And to everyone that's involved with it, agency representatives, consultants, tribal community members, TIPOs, tribal elders. That involves a lot of quick and harmonious work. But that being said, the process is often pretty smooth. I'm not going to pretend it's smooth 100% of the time, but in Wisconsin, we work together pretty well, especially compared to some neighboring states. I think our process has been tried and proven. And in most cases, we're able to resolve most issues in ways that everyone can accept. Like I said, everyone would, of course, prefer that for there to be no disturbance to begin with, but in unanticipated circumstances, we're pretty good at resolving in ways that people can accept. Um, and what I'd really like to do, but unfortunately I can't for confidentiality reasons, is provide some detailed real life examples. But as I've stated before, situations involving human remains, like locations and details and stuff, they are subject to confidentiality constraints. So unfortunately, I can't provide any real life examples. So I hope that hypothetical is helpful in kind of working through the process we would follow. Um, that sort of process I've worked through hundreds of times, possibly thousands in my career, and it's not always 100% smooth, but it does the job pretty well, and it's got us through some pretty tough situations, which we would prefer never have occurred, but sometimes it just happens, and it's gotten us through it. One of the biggest differences I've seen is, and to get back to that point I made earlier, is we want, if at all possible, to just avoid disturbance. And certain projects are just better suited to that. Um, just to
Oh,
give an example, say, and again, this is entirely hypothetical, but say a telecommunications company wants to build, a cell tower, and they pick out this location, and it's in a farm field, and they've got a lease on the land, or they purchase the land, or however they get access. They start their process, and they learn that under 15770 there is an uncatalogued burial site there, and SHPO's recommendation is to just not do anything there if you can do that. In that example, it's fairly easy for them to just move their tower somewhere else. They have the resources and the ability to work around that. They can do exactly what they want to do, except in a place which is not a known burial site. A lot of other places don't have that kind of luxury, and the DOT is a great example. Um, there are some just really unfortunate examples from history, and one that I can share with you that's specific because it's publicly known. You can get on, Google Maps if you'd like, and look up this location yourself. Is Man Mound in Sauk County in Baraboo. It's this really well-known, really extraordinary, like, effigy mound site. But at some point, just built a road right through it. And legally, under 15770, these effigy mounds are considered burial sites, so it's subject to the protections of 15770. So say that road running through there needs work. And I just kind of want to be careful how I share this, so I don't reveal anything confidential, because the location is, I can share the location with you, and that legally speaking, effigy mounds are burial sites in Wisconsin. But when you're dealing with, say, a mound group or a series of effigy mounds, which might not be obvious, the public driving by might not know that there were mounds there at one point, or there may still be mounds there, but they're just not obvious to the untrained eye. But there's a road that runs through there that needs to be worked on. The ability to move that project somewhere else is extremely, extremely limited. In fact, it may make things even worse. And again, I'll just make this hypothetical example. You've got this large mound group, which is legally protected as a burial site. There is a road running through it. You can't really move the road, because that's just going to create new disturbance that wasn't there to begin with. You're more likely to end up in an undesirable situation where there's new disturbance of human remains being made. So the best thing you can really do in that scenario is just operate within your, operational constraints, avoid new disturbance to the degree possible, but ultimately you are still working within that legally protected burial site, which we don't want to do. But in that example, it's necessary, because any changes we would make would just make the situation even worse. And so that flexibility is one big difference I've seen working on different sorts of projects. Is sometimes you can just move it, and sometimes you can't.
In this example with the mound where there's a road running right through it, can you educate us? I'm imagining that road was built before the 1985, when 15770 was established. Is that correct? That road?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So, we can't ever say it with certainty, but if that road attempted to be built in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, that would not have likely occurred. That would not have happened. That mound would have been protected. Is that fair?
Yes. If we're talking about a completely new road being built rather than just an old road being rehabilitated, yes, it would be. I cannot think of any circumstances under which a new road would be built through a recorded burial site. And I'm not aware of that happening since the passage of 15770. Like, it's not to say there's not some obscure example out there, but I've never heard of an example being built through a burial site, a new road being built through a burial site since the passage of 15770. I think one of the biggest ones is seeing just how seriously agencies, developers, like certain developers, um, the public take the protection of burial sites within the state of Wisconsin. Because, I mean, like I said, many recorded burial sites are now underneath, a variety of development projects, because prior to 1985, especially, I'd say the period through about 1960 was the craziest. It started to taper off after that, but it continued through the legal protections of the burial protection law. But today, just, you can walk through a neighborhood and it just looks like a completely built up neighborhood. You've got, streets, buildings, underground utilities, sewer, storm sewer, water, gas, electric, et cetera, et cetera. The area is entirely developed. There's disturbance, down to well below the frost line for utility installation. But just seeing just how seriously agencies still take their protection role, even though the level of development there means that whatever was there in the past has likely, unfortunately, been destroyed by careless development, back in history. I've seen lots of situations where underground utilities are being replaced or the road is being replaced within the existing footprint, and there's going to be almost new ground disturbance, but still archaeologists are on site monitoring every little piece of disturbance on the off chance that there is something there that had not been previously disturbed, in which case the goal, as I said, is to prevent further disturbance. I think a lot of times the public often assumes that disturbance equals destruction and or disappearance, and that once a certain level of disturbance has taken place, that there's no longer any consideration given to preservation. And at least in the state of Wisconsin, that is just not true. There may be a parking lot there today, but because a letter to Charles E. Brown in 1908 said that historically remains were found there, if that parking lot is being, pulled up and resurfaced, SHPO needs to be aware of that. They need to give their okay to that work. They will put legal constraints on that work as far as monitoring and, depth of excavation restrictions, or, what have you, just fill in the blank. Even though to the untrained eye, it looks just like it's a parking lot. If there was something there, the thought is like it's not there anymore. And I think the biggest professional insight for me was just learning how seriously, that protective role is taken by both SHPO, by various government agencies, and including a lot of private contractors and developers. I know private contractors and developers often get a bad rap, and there there are some bad ones out there. I'm not going to pretend they're not, but lots of them are very serious about respecting the law and following the process and doing everything they can to avoid disturbance on their end as well. And that was, I think, one of the biggest insights for me, was realizing just how detailed the database is and how serious people are about respecting it and respecting the law and the process, specifically for two reasons. One, to avoid any further disturbance to what may have already been disturbed to some degree in the past, and also just out of respect for the dignity of people that were once there, or may still be there, depending on the situation. It varies a lot. My advice would be to just focus on. I personally have gotten a lot of value out of not just networking. I have my own issues with the term networking that we don't need to get into, but relationship building with people from a variety of perspectives, um, focusing on this issue. So it's very helpful to me to be able to actually understand the mindset, the interest, the approach of, say, a state agency who wants to complete this development project, but at the same time also understanding and being able to empathize with the perspective of, a TIPO, a tribal member, a native person who is going to have their own thoughts on the entire situation. And at the same time with just, like a regular, resident, the person living down the street from where that development's going to happen. And that's something which some people some people I've worked with in the course of my career have been better at that than others, and I really do see the results and the outcome. I'm not going to pretend, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend that everything always goes 100% smoothly, that there's never controversy, there's never disagreements, you know, there's never uncomfortable situations, but in my experience, the the developers, the agencies, whoever, they really do make an effort to understand and consider the input of, say, the tribes, of, the residents, and the tribes really attempt to understand the perspective of, the agencies and the residents. Um, there's a lot of good faith dialogue and informational exchange, which, while it doesn't eliminate tough situations, but it makes resolving them in a way that everyone can accept, even if they're not 100% happy with, much better. And so I would encourage students to, whether they want to work with, say, maybe they want to work in a TIPO office, maybe they want to work with a government agency, maybe they want to work with a private consultant, regardless, genuinely attempt to seek out and understand where everybody is coming from, because that makes it a lot easier. Um, Everyone has different motivations, everyone's going to have different emphases, and sometimes they're going to conflict. That's just the way it is. But those conflicts are much easier to resolve and compromise on when people are considering, the other person's viewpoint. And just to kind of give a general example, a tribe might not want a certain project to occur in a certain place, and the state understands that and makes every effort to move it somewhere else. If that's not doable, we're going to do our best to work with the tribe and find a compromise that everyone can accept. It's not necessarily a disagreement free way to approach things, but that good faith effort to understand it removes a lot of the bad blood, which prevents
Mhm.
the best possible outcome, even if it's not a perfect outcome.
Mhm.
And so for students who want to work in government, they should try to build relationships in tribes. For students who want to work in tribes, they should try to build relationships in government, and just kind of understand from a variety of perspectives, not just the perspective that their specific role is demanding.
Mhm.
I hope that's helpful.
Mhm. Yes, thank you so much. I'm glad that you were able to use there for the. Thank you tremendously for making time, for sharing your professional life, letting us like open a window into your professional life and look inside.